I'm Josie Haynes. I've been in the tech industry for 22 years now. And my passion and my mission is really around retaining women in tech. And that's what inspired me to become a coach for engineering leaders. And so let me tell you a little bit about my journey. In early 2018, I left Apple and I had a great time, but I was burnt out. I was tired of how women in tech were treated. I call it death by a thousand paper cuts. It's the little things that happen on a daily basis, but that add up. And I thought I was going to walk away and leave the tech industry. After I did some journaling and meditation and really took some time to work through the burnout, I realized something. Technology is impacting all aspects of our daily lives. And it's impacting me so much more than when I had started this 22 years ago. But yet, technology does not fully address the needs of women and underrepresented minorities. Here's a prime example. A few months ago, I took my first flight post-COVID, and I was flying to Tampa to visit my dad. And I went to wash my hands in the bathroom, as one does after using the bathroom, and I put my hand under the soap dispenser, and I got soap. I noticed something very interesting going down the way, though. There was a Black woman, and she was struggling. She was trying to get soap, putting her hand under the soap dispenser. And then she turned to the lady next to her and said, "This just isn't working. Do you mind putting your hand under there for me?" And the other woman did, and soap came out. I realized at that point in time that that woman has had this happen so many times to her that she knows the soap dispenser is not going to detect her darker skin tone. And she's better off just asking somebody else for help. This is 2022. I was in an international airport bathroom in the United States. We should not be having products that are not inclusive to so many people in our world. And yet this is a problem, not just with technology, but honestly with everything that's being built. And so that's why, when I said, I have to come back to tech in my roles. And so when I decided to come back to tech in late 2018, I joined Tile, and I said to the CEO at the time, "Hey, if you want me to join, I want to be your platform engineering director, but I also want to make sure inclusion is not lip service. And I can start a mentoring program that I'm very passionate about and lead your DEI initiatives." And CJ said to me, "You know what? I promised my wife I wanted to make Tile the best place for women to work in the Valley." And so I joined, and it was amazing. I launched that mentoring program. 7 people within Tile were able to switch roles within for 3 years we were running it, and more. We created such an inclusive culture that it was something that everybody in the company was so proud of. And so, I was happy that I accomplished my goal. I realized something new, though. If I did this one company at a time, I was not really going to fulfill my mission around keeping women in tech. And so I decided, you know what? The best way for me to do this is to empower engineering leaders to be doing this at lots of different tech companies and ensuring that we're really creating inclusive, high-performing teams across all of tech so that everybody has the culture where they can thrive. And why is this so important, right? And well, not only is it so that we can build more inclusive products, we have 37% of our employees leaving every year because they felt that they weren't being treated fairly. And 57% of those would have stayed if their companies had addressed their concerns. And so, and that problem, actually, if you hadn't seen my post earlier this week, is costing the tech industry $16 billion a year. Because if you take them to the fact that it costs about $144,000 to replace somebody in the tech industry, and that's actually low for engineers, That adds up when it's 37% leaving to inequity. That adds up to that $16 billion price tag. And that's actually low if you take into account the fact that if you leave a company due to that, if I can empower engineering leaders to build inclusive teams, we can finally stop the bleeding. And then we can change the statistic, which is that 56% of women are leaving the tech industry after 10 to 20 years. And so that's really why I'm doing this. And so my focus is really on building these inclusive, high-performing teams. And I talk about the fact that there are three pillars that we can think about as leaders, any level of leader, to build more diversity, equity, and inclusion within your team. The first pillar is thinking about those comprehensive DEI practices. And this is where a lot of companies tend to focus. However, a lot of people tend to delegate that to HR. And I say, as leaders, we have a big ability to influence these things. We can be partners with recruiting to make sure that we've got inclusive hiring practices. We can make sure those benefits are inclusive and advocate for inclusive benefits if we don't have them. Did you know that giving men equal amounts of paternity leave as women is actually beneficial for women? Because then the women can actually spend more time at home with their kids and not feel they have to come back to work and be balancing that as well. So that's just one example where as leaders, we can impact and influence these things. The second and third pillar, though, are the ones that we need to be focusing on to be creating these inclusive cultures. And it's how we actually move the needle under the retention piece. So pillar 2, that's creating that inclusive culture where everyone feels that they can thrive and that their opinions are valued and matter for the greater good. And then, so as a leader there, are you creating psychological safety on your teams? Are you creating an environment where it's okay to be vulnerable and make mistakes? And mistakes are treated as learning opportunities. You know, a big way that we can see this is what do code reviews look like? How much vulnerability and empathy is being used there? And that I have a whole talk on empathy and code reviews that I'd be happy to share with folks if you're interested. So just let me know. And then the final pillar, which is the one that us as leaders can really have the biggest impact around and the most development, is as leaders, we need to have effective and fair management practices and principles. So many times, myself included, we are promoted to leaders, to a new level of leadership with zero training and how to be an effective and fair leader. I mean, usually how to be a leader in general, let alone being effective and fair. And so what we don't know, though, can very negatively impact the diversity and inclusion in our teams. And what do I mean by that? Well, we're the ones promoting people, determining who gets hired, who gets to work on what projects, who gets paid, who gets invited to that meeting. And all of these can have a direct impact on inclusion and belonging. And so we can very easily be negatively impacting inclusion without knowing it. And so we could be contributing to that $16 billion loss in tech, tend to get less concrete technical feedback than men. And so we can slow down our thinking in times where bias shows up and think, hey, how can I be sure to be giving everybody on my team the right level of technical feedback that they need? And that's just one example, right? How do you build that psychological safety in your team? How do you come at things from a place of curiosity and really encourage learning and growth? And finally, how do you use empathy as the foundation, right? I keep mentioning empathy because I do truly believe that empathy is the foundation for so much of what we need to be thinking about to be building these inclusive and high performing teams. And it's empathy for your colleagues, it's empathy for your team members, it's empathy for your customers, and it's empathy for yourself, right? And really taking the time to think about what others are going through, and really understanding their feelings. And so these are just a few of the ways that you could be applying these three pillars. And applying them will move the needle around retaining all of your talent and helping you build a more inclusive and high performing team. And so that's the other area that I think I'm a little different as a coach. I feel like a lot of coaches focus on either purely the soft skill side, or they focus on the engineering side, right? We've got so many folks talking about DORA metrics and productivity. And I say we as engineering leaders, we have some of the hardest roles, especially when we get to that exec table. Not only do we have a really technical foundation that we need to understand when we're dealing with our team, when we're dealing with other executives, we need to understand how to turn technical impact and metrics into something that the non-technical folks understand. How do we relate it back to that business impact, right? And I truly believe that we can be doing this in, empathetic ways, and really creating inclusive environments. And so those are some of the things that I really talk about. And this is why I think having a coach, honestly, is so invaluable, because, it helps you think through some of these challenges that you may not have. Like, how did a coach help me? And, that's one of the things. I decided to go into coaching because I truly believed in the benefits from it. I was able to create my VP role at Tile because I had an amazing coach who showed me, like, hey, you can create a role for yourself. I was able to figure out how to balance my time and happiness and be more productive, get strategies and changes across. And so these are some of the reasons that I decided to go into coaching. And again, think about it holistically from both the engineering leadership and technical side, as well as the empathetic side, and to be creating a holistic approach to thinking about engineering leadership. And so along those lines, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is the SPACE framework. And for those of you who haven't heard about the SPACE framework, it comes from the folks who wrote the Accelerate book, which is where the DORA metrics are defined. And those metrics talk a lot about developer productivity and the four different aspects of when it comes to developer productivity. And one of the things that I noticed when I first learned about the DORA metrics is that I thought, these are very technical engineering metric focused. And if we just focus on these, we might not be thinking about the big picture. And so I was really happy to see the evolution of that and turning it into the SPACE framework, because I do feel like that thinks about engineering and leadership and how we build high performing teams in a more holistic way. But today I want to talk about how do you add inclusion to the SPACE framework. So I'm going to go through each of the letters and talk about how I would add a little bit more inclusion into each of these. And so first, let's start with the S in SPACE. That's the S in SPACE is for satisfaction and well-being. So this is how are you doing, right? Are your folks getting burnt out? And this directly ties to inclusion, because if your team members do not feel like their opinions are valued, if they don't feel they can be vulnerable and speak up and share an opinion, they're not going to be satisfied and they're going to burn out. And so inclusion directly impacts the S in the SPACE framework. Then let's talk about the P. The P is performance. And so here we're really talking about the outcomes of the systems and processes. So for us in the engineering world, let's talk about quality, right? A lot of it ultimately comes to quality versus, how much we're producing. And, what is the impact to the customer when it comes to performance? And so when it comes to inclusion, we want to think about performance and for all folks, right? And so I think accessibility is a big one that I'm seeing being thought about more, not as an afterthought, but as part of the, core product. And I think that's something that we do need to be thinking about on a regular basis when it comes to the performance piece. And this is important. I gave some kudos on LinkedIn. Actually, I saw that Udemy did some recognition, was doing speech recognition on transcriptions so that they could transcribe their videos. And they actually went and did research to find which company would be able to transcribe not just the majority, but all of their videos. And they looked into the different aspects of, accents and tone, which I thought was great from an inclusive point of view. Because, for example, voice assistants are known to be less accurate with female voices than those with accents. And that's because a lot of the testing is done by the employees. And when the majority of the employees tend to be white men, then we have a challenge. And so this is just one example where inclusion directly can impact performance, because for a customer who may have an accent, the performance will be directly tied to whether the product can understand them. The next letter in space is the A, and that's really measuring activities and counts of actions and outputs. And this is kind of where the Dora metrics tend to fall in. And so we look at what your CI/CD activities, the how much design and coding there is, and here's where I really think that empathy and code reviews comes in. I feel we can take a step back and see, hey, can we measure how empathetic we think our code reviews are? And what do I mean by empathy and code reviews? Well, just one example is there's a lot of negative bias for text. And so many times I see questions start with, why did you or why didn't you? Now, if your partner came up to you and said, why didn't you do the dishes, Josie? I mean, I'd be pretty pissed, honestly. And so why are we coming across with that same attitude in our text, in our code reviews? One alternative could be come at it from a place of curiosity instead and say something like, hey, I noticed this variable wasn't used anywhere. I'm curious if it still needs to be here. That is a much more empathetic approach, and it's an activity that you could actually measure and see how empathetic and vulnerable are folks willing to be in code reviews. The next area of the SPACE framework is the C, and that is for communication and collaboration. And I truly believe inclusion has a huge place to play here. Because again, if you don't feel included, you're not going to be willing to be vulnerable. And as leaders, we need to be creating the psychological safety so that folks can be vulnerable. We need to learn how to have those uncomfortable conversations in an effective way, how to give feedback in a way that's impactful, how to not just be the third wheel when two of your employees are arguing, and really empower them to solve their challenges. And this is all how inclusion can really play into collaboration and communication. And finally, the E in the space is for efficiency and flow. And, this is really the ability to complete your work with minimal interruptions or delays. And really, this kind of ties into all of the other letters because, depending on what you're measuring, being efficient can detract from other things, right? If I sit in my room and code for 5 straight days, that might be very efficient, but it could be very lacking in collaboration and communication if during that time my team members need me. And so when it comes to inclusion, I think that's where we need to be taking into account what we're measuring and how it impacts the bigger picture. Right? Back in the days when lines of code were a popular measurement, people were like, that's an awful measure of productivity, right? And so realizing that just one metric is not going to move the needle. And again, any metric can have bias. So no matter what parts of this framework you end up taking, I also recommend slowing down, making sure you're removing biases from your thinking, and you're having a group look at anything that you're ending up implementing.